Malik and Micah Johnson spent their evenings searching for scraps of hope in the shadows of the Diamond District. 8 years old, foster kids with no last name that mattered, they were just two more faces lost in the concrete maze, invisible to the powerful men in tailored suits who stepped over them like cracks in the sidewalk. Nobody knew they were experts at listening from the shadows. Their life in the system had taught them that the best way to survive was to stay quiet and stay hidden. While other kids played, Malik and Micah learned to move through the city's VIP garages like ghosts, searching for their only friends, two stray kittens named Pumpkin and Shadow. They had seen Kang Tae-Joon, the titan of the Kang Empire, dozens of times from afar. Salt and pepper hair, a jaw made of granite, and eyes that looked through children as if they were part of the architecture. He was a man who calculated risks but never counted people. His elite bodyguards, Marcus and Ivan, spoke in low, jagged whispers when they thought they were alone. They thought the garage was empty, but Malik and Micah were there, huddled in the dark with their kittens, and they understood every word of the betrayal being laid out in the cold air. The heavy, reinforced doors of the VIP elevator hissed open, and Kang Tae-Joon stepped out into the dim, climate-controlled silence of the underground garage. He moved with the practiced precision of a man who measured his life in seconds and decimal points. His charcoal suit didn't hold a single crease, and his salt and pepper hair was swept back with a severity that matched his expression. In his right hand, he gripped a black leather briefcase, the physical manifestation of a multi-billion-dollar empire. And in his mind, he was already miles away, calculating the risks of the evening's mountain summit. To Tae-Joon, the world was a chessboard of assets and liabilities. Sentiment was a luxury he had discarded decades ago, right along with the concept of trust. He walked toward his black luxury sedan, his eyes skimming over his security detail without truly seeing them. They were tools, no different from the encrypted phone in his pocket or the armored glass of his vehicle. "The route is cleared, sir," Marcus Grant said, his bald head gleaming under the fluorescent lights as he held the rear door open. Tae-Joon gave a curt, absent nod, his mind spinning with figures. He didn't notice the slight tremor in Marcus's hand, nor did he see Ivan Petrov leaning toward the assistant, Min-seo, whispering a distraction that kept her eyes glued to a tablet. 30 feet away, tucked behind a thick concrete pillar, Malik and Micah held their breath. The air in the garage smelled of expensive gasoline and cold dampness. Malik squeezed Pumpkin, the orange kitten, against his chest, feeling the tiny creature's heart racing against his own. Beside him, Micah clutched Shadow, his eyes wide and shimmering with a terror that went beyond their usual fear of being caught in places they didn't belong. They had come here for the kittens. Pumpkin had chased a moth into the darkness of the VIP level, and Shadow had followed. But as they had crouched in the shadows of a parked SUV, the boys had heard the voices. Not the professional, clipped tones the guards used with the boss, but something jagged and sharp. They heard Marcus speak of a handshake deal with the rival syndicate, and Ivan describe exactly how the steering column would lock once the car hit 60 miles per hour on the mountain pass. Malik looked at the powerful man with the briefcase. Tae-Joon looked like a king, standing there in the light, but to Malik he looked like a man walking toward a cliff. The twins shared a silent, panicked look. They were just kids from a transition home, wearing faded hoodies and sneakers with worn soles. To the men in suits, they weren't even ghosts. They were nothing. But as Tae-Joon raised his foot to step into the car, Malik felt the weight of the secret burning in his chest. If they stayed silent, the man with the salt and pepper hair would never come back. Malik pressed his back against the cold, damp concrete, his fingers trembling as he stroked Pumpkin's soft ears to keep the kitten silent. Micah was a mirror image of his brother, his knuckles white as he gripped Shadow. From their vantage point in the dark, the world was a series of polished shoes and heavy tires, but the voices carrying across the garage were crystal clear. "The sensor is bypassed," Ivan Petrov whispered, his voice low and gravelly, stripped of the respect he showed Tae-Joon. He leaned against the hood of the luxury sedan, checking his watch. "At 55 miles per hour, the electronic steering will override. When he hits the first sharp curve on the ridge, the car will go straight. No skid marks, no evidence. Just a tragic accident for a man who worked too hard. Marcus Grant let out a short, dry chuckle that made Malik's blood run cold. The bald guard adjusted his earpiece, his eyes scanning the garage with a predatory flick, though he looked right over the dark corner where the boys huddled. And the brakes? Hydraulics are rigged to a slow leak, Ivan replied, his thumb tracing the seam of his black blazer. By the time he realizes the steering is locked, he'll reach for the pedal and find nothing but air. He won't even have time to scream. Micah looked at Malik, his eyes filling with tears. They had seen Tae-Joon on the news. They had seen him walk past their alleyway a dozen times. He was the man who never looked down, but he was a person, not a target. The twins had spent their lives being shuffled from one house to another, discarded by adults who found them inconvenient. To hear these men talking about ending a life with such cold, mechanical precision felt like a weight crushing their small lungs. 5 o'clock sharp, Marcus said, his tone final. He's got a meeting with the investors at the summit. He prides himself on being on time. That pride is going to bury him. The twins watched as the two men shared a look of grim understanding, a silent pact of betrayal. The garage felt smaller, the air thicker with the scent of oil and impending death. Malik looked down at Pumpkin, who let out a tiny, barely audible purr. He realized then that they weren't just two boys looking for kittens anymore. They were the only witnesses to a murder that hadn't happened yet. They had exactly 8 minutes before the man with the salt and pepper hair turned the key and drove toward a mountain he would never descend. Malik nudged Micah. A silent signal passed between them that the shadows were no longer a refuge. They had to move. With their kittens tucked tightly into their hoodies, the twins darted from behind the pillar, their sneakers slapping softly against the polished concrete. They bypassed the guards, weaving through the maze of parked luxury vehicles until they reached Young Min Seo. The assistant stood near the rear of the sedan, her reddish-brown hair catching the overhead light as she adjusted her round eyeglasses, her focus entirely on the digital itinerary glowing on her tablet. "Miss, please, miss." Malik's voice was a frantic whisper that broke the sterile silence of the garage. Min Seo jumped, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of pure shock. She looked down, her eyes widening as she processed the sight of two disheveled boys in green hoodies appearing out of the gloom. "How did you get down here? This is a restricted area." "The car," Micah gasped, his face pale and focused. "You can't let him get in the car. Those men, the ones with the suits, they did something to the steering. They said at 55 miles per hour it locks." Min Seo blinked, her initial alarm fading into a weary, practiced skepticism. She looked at their worn sneakers, their messy hair, and the tiny, furry heads of Pumpkin and Shadow peeking out from their jackets. To her, they didn't look like witnesses. They looked like the desperate children from the neighboring district who occasionally tried to slip past security to beg for a few one. "Listen to me," she said, her tone softening but remaining firm, the way one speaks to a child who has watched too many movies. "Mr. Kang is a very busy man. We don't have time for games or stories." "It's not a story," Malik insisted, reaching out to grab the sleeve of her blazer. "They talked about a handshake deal. They said the brakes are leaking. 5 o'clock, they said 5 o'clock would bury him." Min Seo pulled her arm back gently, her expression shifting to one of pity. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small clip of bills. "Is this what this is about? I understand things are hard, but you can't make up frightening things to get attention. Take this and go back to the lobby before the security team sees you. If Marcus finds you here, he won't be as patient as I am." She pressed the money toward them, her eyes already drifting back to her tablet. The wall of her disbelief was absolute, built on years of serving a man who viewed everyone as a threat or a tool. To her, the twins were a minor, heartbreaking distraction in a high-stakes day. Malik looked at the money, then at the black car that sat like a waiting coffin. The adults weren't listening, and the clock on Min Seo's tablet just flickered to 4:54 p.m. The money Min-seo offered fluttered in the air, but Malik didn't take it. His eyes weren't on the cash. They were locked on the rearview mirror of the sedan. In the reflection, a pair of cold, dark eyes had fixed onto them. Marcus Grant had turned away from the car, his arms uncurling from his chest. The practiced mask of a loyal protector was slipping, revealing something jagged and predatory underneath. He had heard the word handshake, and his jaw had tightened into a white-knuckled line. "Min-seo," Marcus's voice boomed, echoing off the low concrete ceiling. "I'll handle the intruders. Get to the elevator and check the boss's status." Min-seo nodded, relieved to be relieved of the awkward encounter, and hurried away toward the lobby entrance. As soon as she disappeared through the glass doors, the atmosphere in the garage shifted from clinical to lethal. Marcus didn't run. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride that signaled he knew exactly how trapped the boys were. "Run," Malik hissed. The twins bolted, sprinting toward the lobby doors just as Marcus began to pick up speed. They burst through the glass into the opulent warmth of the hotel's main floor, their sneakers squeaking on the marble. Here, the world was filled with golden chandeliers and the scent of expensive lilies, a jarring contrast to the metallic death sentence they had just escaped. They wove through a group of businessmen, using their small frames to disappear behind a luggage cart. Malik could feel Pumpkin's claws digging into his sweatshirt as the kitten sensed his heartbeat hammering like a drum. Looking back, he saw Marcus emerge into the lobby. The guard wasn't shouting. He was moving silently, his bald head reflecting the amber light as he signaled to Ivan Petrov via his earpiece. It was a silent hunt. To the tourists and guests, Marcus looked like a diligent security officer looking for a lost child. To Malik and Micah, he was a wolf in a suit. They ducked behind a massive marble pillar, their breaths coming in shallow, jagged hitches. Marcus was closing the distance, his eyes scanning the floor, tracing the path of two boys who knew too much. He stopped just feet away, the shadow of his large frame stretching across the floor toward the twins' hidden feet. Malik looked at the lobby clock. 4:56 p.m. In 4 minutes, the man with the salt and pepper hair would step out, and Marcus would ensure the boys never got close enough to speak. Micah gripped Malik's hand, his eyes wet with a terror that transcended words. They were being hunted in a room full of people, and for the first time in their lives, being invisible wasn't a curse. It was their only hope for survival. The golden hands of the grandfather clock in the lobby swept toward the vertical line of the hour with an agonizing, rhythmic click. 4:58 p.m. The heavy thud of Marcus's footsteps sounded just on the other side of the marble pillar, a slow and predatory packing that meant he knew they were cornered. But suddenly, the lobby's main elevator chimed, a deep, resonant tone that signaled the arrival of the king. Kang Tae-Joon emerged, his charcoal suit a sharp contrast to the warm light of the hotel. He was the picture of unshakable authority, his black leather briefcase held firmly as he began his trek toward the revolving doors. He didn't look left or right. He simply moved forward, a man possessed by the gravity of his own schedule. Behind him, Min-seo followed, her brow furrowed as she glanced at the time. "Now," Malik whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. The twins didn't run away from the danger, they ran toward it. They burst from behind the pillar, sprinting across the polished floor toward the revolving doors. Marcus reacted instantly, his hand reaching into his jacket for his radio, his face contorting into a mask of cold fury. "Stop them!" he hissed into his earpiece, but the twins were small and fueled by a raw, frantic energy. They reached the glass doors just as Tae-Joon stepped through into the humid air of the garage. The boys didn't hesitate. They collided with the spinning glass, tumbling out into the concrete bay just as the black sedan's lights flashed, a remote start initiated by the driver. The low, guttural hum of the engine filled the space, sounding to Malik like the growl of a beast waking up to claim its prey. Tae-Joon was 3 steps from the door. 2. His hand reached out for the handle, his fingers inches from the cold metal that would seal his fate. The twins could see the other guards, Ivan and Min-ho. straightening their ties, their faces devoid of emotion as they prepared to watch a man drive to his death. There was no time to explain, no time to beg for a hearing. The boys saw the car, they saw the man, and they saw the seconds vanishing like smoke. "Mr. Kang," Malik screamed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with a piercing, high-pitched urgency that even the engine couldn't drown out. Malik and Micah threw themselves into the path between the man and the door, their kittens clutched to their chests like shields. Tae-Joon froze. His hand stopped midair, his fingers hovering just a fraction of an inch from the handle. He looked down, his salt and pepper eyebrows knitting together in a confused and cautious expression. For the first time in his life, the man who looked through everyone was forced to look down. The air in the garage seemed to solidify as the twins occupied the narrow space between Kang Tae-Joon and the driver's side door. The engine's vibration thrummed through the soles of their sneakers, a mechanical heartbeat counting down the final seconds. Tae-Joon stood motionless, his left hand slightly raised in a reflexive gesture, a silent command to wait that was directed as much to his encroaching security team as it was to the boys. He looked down, his serious expression etched with a deep, cautious confusion. Before him stood two boys with medium brown skin, their faces flushed with a mixture of terror and fierce resolve. They looked entirely out of place in this world of charcoal wool and armored steel, their green hoodies stained with the dust of the garage, and their hands occupied by two fluffy, wide-eyed kittens. "What is this?" Tae-Joon's voice was like ice cracking, low, resonant, and dangerous. Behind him, Marcus Grant had reached the perimeter, his face a thundercloud of suppressed rage. "Sir, I apologize. These street kids have been harassing the staff all afternoon. I'll remove them immediately." Marcus stepped forward, his large hand reaching for Malik's shoulder. "Don't let him touch us," Micah shrieked, pulling Shadow closer to his chest. The gray kitten let out a soft, frightened mewl that seemed to pierce the sterile tension of the bay. Malik didn't flinch. He looked directly into Tae-Joon's stone-cold eyes, refusing to be invisible for 1 second longer. "He's the one, Marcus and Ivan. They're the ones who did it." Tae-Joon's eyes flickered toward his head of security. The silence that followed was deafening. To any other billionaire, this would have been a nuisance to be swept away, but Tae-Joon had survived 30 years in the underworld by noticing the things others ignored. He saw the way Marcus's jaw remained locked, and he saw the genuine, raw panic in Malik's eyes, a panic that had nothing to do with being caught and everything to do with the car. "Stay back, Marcus," Tae-Joon commanded without looking at him. The guard froze, his hand hovering in midair. Tae-Joon turned his full, intimidating attention back to the twins. He was a man who lived by logic, and logic dictated that two children would not risk the wrath of the Kang Empire for a prank. "You have 30 seconds, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Tell me why you are standing in front of my car." Malik took a jagged breath, the orange fur of Pumpkin tickling his chin. "They think we're just kids who don't understand," he whispered, his voice trembling but clear. "But we heard them. We heard everything." Malik didn't blink, even as the shadow of Marcus Grant loomed like a predator behind him. He leaned in close to Tae-Joon, the smell of the man's expensive cologne mixing with the scent of the garage's oil. "They said the electronic steering will override at 55 miles per hour, Malik whispered, his voice gaining a terrifying edge of certainty. "They said it would lock on the first sharp curve of the ridge. And the handshake deal with the rival, they said it was already done." Beside him, Micah nodded frantically, his grip tightening on Shadow. "And the hydraulics, they said they rigged a slow leak. They said when you reach for the pedal, you'll find nothing but air." A sharp, audible gasp broke the silence. Young Min-seo stood a few feet away, her hand flying to her mouth, her round eyeglasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent overheads. Her face had gone a ghostly shade of white. As the assistant who managed Tae-Joon's most sensitive communications, she knew that the handshake deal, was a term used only in top-secret negotiations that had occurred just 48 hours prior. Negotiations the twins could not possibly have known about unless they had been listening to the men who guarded his door. Tae-Joon's expression didn't shift, but his eyes went from curious to lethal. He looked at Marcus, then at Ivan, who was standing by the car's rear. Both men had gone unnaturally still. "Min-ho," Tae-Joon said, addressing the third bodyguard who stood by the phone. "Bring the portable lift, now." The minutes that followed felt like hours. The loyal security team moved with clinical speed, sliding the hydraulic jacks under the sedan and hoisting the heavy vehicle into the air. Marcus tried to step back, his eyes darting toward the exit, but Tae-Joon's loyalists already had their hands on their holsters. A mechanic from the hotel's private bay stepped forward, shining a high-lumen flashlight into the undercarriage. He pumped the brake pedal from the driver's side, his face tightening. Suddenly, a hiss echoed through the garage. A dark, oily fluid began to spray from a severed line, pooling on the concrete like a black wound. "The line was scored, sir," the mechanic reported, his voice shaking. "One more pump and the pressure would have failed entirely, and the steering. The bypass chip is right here. It's wired to the GPS. It would have triggered exactly where the boy said." Min-seo let out a stifled sob of horror. Tae-Joon looked at the black pool of fluid, then at the two boys in green hoodies. He realized that if he had entered that car, he would have been a dead man within 20 minutes. The silence was broken only by the soft, rhythmic purring of Pumpkin and Shadow. The man of salt and pepper hair turned back to his security chief, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Take them to the sub-level," Tae-Joon commanded. "I'll deal with the traitors myself." The garage erupted into a disciplined, silent chaos. Loyalists who had remained in the shadows materialized like spirits, their movements efficient and devoid of mercy. Marcus and Ivan didn't fight back. The weight of their own exposed treason seemed to collapse their spines. As they were marched toward the sub-level elevators, Marcus cast one final, hateful glance toward the twins, but Tae-Joon stepped into his line of sight, a wall of charcoal gray that signaled the guard's time in the sun was over. Once the heavy doors hissed shut, a profound, ringing silence reclaimed the garage. The smell of leaked brake fluid hung heavy in the air, a dark reminder of the accident that had been averted. Min-ho and the remaining guards stood at a respectful distance, their postures rigid with a new, heightened vigilance. Min-seo remained off to the side, her hands still trembling as she wiped her eyes behind her glasses, her gaze fixed on the floor in shame for her earlier dismissal. Tae-Joon stood alone in the center of the bay. He looked at his luxury sedan, now a useless hunk of metal suspended on a lift, and then he slowly turned to Malik and Micah. For the first time, he didn't see them as a nuisance, a distraction, or a charity case. He saw them as the only two people in his entire world who hadn't been bought. He walked toward them, his leather soles clicking softly on the concrete. He stopped just 3 feet away, and in a move that caused Min-seo to gasp, the most powerful man in the district slowly went down on one knee. He was now at eye level with the boys, his salt and pepper hair silvered under the harsh garage lights. "You knew the risk," Tae-Joon said, his voice no longer a cold blade but something heavy and resonant. "You knew those men were dangerous. You knew I was a stranger who might not even listen." Malik shifted Pumpkin higher on his chest, the orange kitten's fur glowing against his green hoodie. We couldn't let it happen," he whispered. "It was wrong." Tae-Joon looked at their small, dirty sneakers and the way they shielded their kittens as if they were the most precious things in the world. He had spent a lifetime believing that everyone had a price, and that kindness was merely a mask for an ulterior motive. Yet, these two children who had nothing had risked their lives to save a man who had everything, and they had asked for nothing in return. "I have built an empire on the idea that people are tools," Tae-Joon said, his voice cracking with a rare, raw honesty. "But today, I was saved by two boys who treated me like a human being." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently placed it on Malik's shoulder. It wasn't the grip of a boss. It was the touch of a man who had finally been found. The following morning, the sun struggled to pierce the gray mist hanging over the district where the Foster transition home sat, a crumbling brick building that the city had long ago forgotten. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of floor wax and old wood. Malik and Micah sat on their narrow cots, Pumpkin and Shadow curled into a single ball of orange and gray fur between them. They were waiting for the lecture, the scolding for disappearing into the Diamond District the night before, but the house mother remained silent, her eyes glued to the window. A fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their engines a low, synchronized hum that silenced the neighborhood dogs. When the door of the lead vehicle opened, Kang Tae-Joon stepped out. He looked entirely out of place against the peeling paint and rusted iron fences, his charcoal suit gleaming and his black briefcase held at his side. Beside him, Min-seo walked with a new sense of purpose, carrying a stack of legal folders. Tae-Joon didn't wait for an invitation. He entered the foyer, his eyes taking in the cramped quarters, the flickering lights, and the invisible children who watched him from the hallways with wide, hollow eyes. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar ache in his chest, a realization that while he had been building skyscrapers, a whole world of potential was being left to wither in the shadows. He found the twins in their room. As he entered, Malik and Micah stood up instinctively, their small frames silhouetted against the morning light. Tae-Joon looked at the cramped space they shared and then at the kittens. He realized that the boys had been protecting those animals with the same fierce loyalty they had shown him in the garage. "Mr. Kang," Micah whispered, his voice small. "I told you yesterday that I owe you my life," Tae-Joon said, his voice echoing in the small room. "But I realized that simply saying thank you is the way of the man I used to be. The man I am now cannot walk away knowing his saviors are living like ghosts." He turned to Min-seo, who stepped forward and opened the first folder. "The paperwork for the transition has been expedited," she said softly, her eyes warm behind her glasses. "You aren't going to another home, boys. You're going to your own." Tae-Joon knelt down, mirroring the position he had taken in the garage. "I spent my life building an empire of stone and glass," he said, looking from Malik to Micah. "It was empty. I'd like to build a different kind of empire now, one where kids like you are never invisible again, but I'll need your help to do it." Malik looked at the kittens, then back at the man with the salt and pepper hair. For the first time, the shadow they had lived in felt like it was finally lifting. The 20th floor office of the Kang Corporation was no longer the tomb of cold silence it had once been. The floor-to-ceiling windows still showcased the sprawling city below, but the reflections in the glass told a different story. The salt and pepper hair of Kang Tae-Joon was a little longer now, and the hard, granite lines of his face had softened into a look of quiet, enduring contentment. He sat at his massive obsidian desk, but he wasn't alone. Malik and Micah, now 9 years old and taller, sat at a smaller mahogany table in the corner, focused intensely on their homework. Their green hoodies had been replaced by high-quality sweaters, but their messy, voluminous curls remained the same. They moved through the office with the confidence of those who knew they belonged, no longer ghosts haunting the periphery of a world that refused to see them. On the corner of Tae-Joon's desk, resting on a custom-made silk cushion near his black leather briefcase, Pumpkin and Shadow were curled together. The orange and gray kittens had grown into sleek, healthy cats who reigned over the executive suite with a calm curiosity. Every so often, Tae-Joon would reach out, his hand pausing in the middle of a multi-million-dollar contract to absent-mindedly stroke Pumpkin's ears. It was a gesture that would have shocked his competitors a year ago, but now, it was simply part of the man he had become. The Johnson Kang name now sat at the head of a massive charitable foundation, one that had replaced Tae-Joon's obsession with corporate conquest. He had realized that his empire wasn't measured by the height of his buildings, but by the safety of the children who lived in their shadows. He had traded his isolation for the chaotic, beautiful life of a father, ensuring that no child in the district would ever feel invisible again. "Appa, look," Micah said, holding up a drawing of their new home. Tae-Joon stood, leaving his work behind without a second thought. He walked over to the twins, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. The same hands that had once signaled for cold, calculated silence were now warm and protective. He looked at the boys who had saved his life not with a bribe or a weapon, but with the simple, pure bravery of a heart that cared. The man who once looked through everyone finally saw everything that mattered. He wasn't just a boss or a titan of industry anymore. He was a protector, a guardian, and most importantly, he was home.